Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to this video series, Unedited and Off-Camber. In this episode, episode 2, we are going to talk about the age-old question, something that gets discussed by every off-roader on the planet, whether you're a Jeep guy or not, and that is, what Jeep is the best Jeep? So let's check it out. All right, guys. So you can't open up this discussion without a couple of factors, all right? I think the main factors when discussing what the best Jeep is what the best Jeep for you is, right? For your uses. Everybody's a little bit different, even all of us Jeepers. Second thing is cost, okay? Cost is a big factor when talking about Jeeps because obviously you can go way back in time and find them pretty inexpensively, and you can come up to the future, to date, and they're approaching $100,000, right? For some of them. So it really just depends on what your uses are, what your budget is, and how much you're willing to spend. And size, right? I mean, that's another thing. The size of the vehicle is a big aspect of it too. So it's another huge deciding factor. So without further ado, let's get into the actual models of Jeeps. Now, there's a lot of them, okay? Specifically talking about the Wrangler style Jeep, right? We're not going to get into the XJs, we're not going to get into the YJ or to the WJs and things like that. But specifically talking about those kinds of vehicles, you can't have a channel or a discussion about this, right? An episode about this without talking about the way back when, 1940s, World War II, flat fender Jeeps, CJs, things like that. And here's the bottom line. Those Jeeps are fantastic, okay? They really, truly are. They're super capable. They're light, so they don't need giant axles. You don't have to put that big of a tire on them because they're so light and so small. They're essentially the size of maybe like a side-by-side, some of them, right? And they're utilitarian by design, right? Back then, everything kind of was. Back in that time period, 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Cars back then were not like they are today, so the technology just wasn't there. Jeeps are that way, right? The old flat fenders, the original ones, they only even had one tail light. They didn't even have two tail lights, let alone three, like a modern vehicle, right? No dash lights, things like that. Very, very, very utilitarian. That's not what everybody out there wants. But if you're looking for something kind of cheap, okay, those can oftentimes be found for a few $1,000s. And with not much money, they can definitely be fairly roadworthy. Now, they're not all that fast, right? You're not cruising down the highway at 75 in one of those. The soft tops were awful. They didn't even really keep the weather out. So, heat and air conditioning, even, certainly no air conditioning. Heat is even a problem in a lot of those, right? So you gotta think about that. So we're not gonna spend a lot of time on that. They're not as commonly available. So we're gonna move on. We're gonna jump right up to the TJ, YJ time frame, okay? That is probably the oldest Jeep that you're still gonna see out on the road fairly often. They're everywhere. And they're everywhere because they're reliable, okay? The engines in those Jeeps, they made a 2.5 liter 4-cylinder and they made a 4.0 liter straight 6. Now, the 2.5 liter 4-cylinder is a great motor. It didn't make any power, okay? But it was a great motor. It was reliable, all right? The 4 liter is a fantastic motor, stood the test of time. There's plenty of them out there with 200,000-300,000 miles or more. They're fantastic. They're low torque. They're everything that you'd want for an off-road style vehicle. They're great. Those vehicles, again, little bit more utilitarian, right, than a newer Jeep. But they had some creature comforts in them, right? The seats were a little bit nicer. The interior was a little bit nicer. They had a radio, right? You could certainly upgrade it and make it pretty good. But they're small still, okay? So you don't need a lot of space. You're not packing a lot of gear with you, right? you can definitely make one of those Jeeps work. Now, the rear seat in one of those Jeeps is almost useless. And the cargo area behind the rear seat pretty much is useless if you're going to run it with a rear seat. Now, I know there's people out there that throw their kids in the back and things like that, and that's fine. But if you're thinking that you're going to have a newborn and you're going to put that rear-facing car seat in the back seat of one of those Jeeps, it's just not going to happen. I'll tell you that right now. It's not going to fit. Okay, so again, though, for a crawler, for, you know, a normal everyday driver, if you don't need something overly fancy and you don't need a lot of space, take that back seat out. You got a bunch of room back there without it. And they're great platforms for crawlers, right? The wheelbase is good. They're just awesome. And there's definitely some aftermarket support. Now, probably the most popular Jeep, arguably, okay? The JK. Now, this is probably where we're going to spend the bulk of our conversation with this video, because the JK was the first Jeep that came out with a couple of things, okay? First of all, it was the first modern-sized Jeep, okay? Because even the TJ, like I said, was a little bit small. The YJ is basically the same. The JK was like a modern-size vehicle, right? In fact, a lot of hardcore true off-roaders don't even like JKs because the interior had some more plastic in it. They were built more like a modern vehicle, okay? So the creature comforts are a little bit more advanced in the JK. The seats are nicer, they're bolstered nicer. The air conditioning blows like crazy in a JK. You know, it has buttons in your steering wheel. I mean, it's got those kinds of things, right? So still a Jeep. It's by no means a luxury vehicle, but those things are there in a vehicle like that. Also, the size of the vehicle, and let's not forget, it's the first vehicle to come out, or it's the first Wrangler that was a four-door from the factory, right? There were some companies way back when that used to take TJs and convert them to four doors. Some of them were done very, very well, but they weren't standard. They were a lot of money, and you still didn't have the creature comforts. There was no problem, right, with the soccer mom or soccer dad buying a Jeep JK like the one behind me and never taking it off-road and using it as a normal everyday vehicle like you would have done with any other SUV back then, okay, when these first came out. But nowadays, they become a lot more affordable, right, especially the early JKs. Motor swaps are happening pretty frequently now, okay? And there's an enormous aftermarket support for the JK because they made over 2 million of them during its run, okay? But here's the funny thing about a JK. You got to be careful about this, all right? So to any of you guys looking for a new JK, if this actually happened to you or someone you know, definitely drop a comment. And guys, before I get into this, if you like what we're doing here on this channel, okay, you like the goal of the channel with giveaways and vehicle giveaways, things like that, definitely please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and let's spread the word, okay? This channel's still kind of new, but it is growing pretty well, and the bigger it gets, the more I can give back to you guys, the subscribers, all right? But anyway, let's get right back to it. So these beautiful beasts here, right, the JK, they're fantastic. They're a great platform. They have a nicer suspension. They have longer control arms. It makes them more comfortable, even with bigger tires. The Dana 44 axles that came in these, especially if it was a Rubicon, right, it would have had the Dana 44 in the front. They were better Dana 44s than the older style Dana 44, right? They're not the same Dana 44. So they made some upgrades with the JK, and they were nice upgrades. The physical size of the vehicle is a lot bigger. Now, depending upon if you're going to off-road it, right, a lot of the trails are tight with a JK because of the size of the vehicle. But here's the funny thing with that. Because they made 2 million of them, and because they are so uber popular, what winds up happening on a lot of these trails is they start to change and adapt to the wheelbase and the width of a JK over time. And that started to happen, especially down here in Texas where I off-road. Now, couple of things. And again, the real important thing is if you find a really cheap JK, and it's an early JK, okay, make sure it has four-wheel drive. I know that's shocking, but yes, guys, okay, they made JKs in two-wheel drive for the first couple of years, right? 2007, 2008. They obviously did away with that pretty quickly, but they did make JKs in two-wheel drive. So if you find a really cheap one and you're like, wow, this is awesome, this is a cheap JK, and then you get home and you're like, where's the lever? How do I put it in four-wheel drive? Real quick fix. Just get underneath the Jeep, look at that front axle, make sure it has a differential in it, make sure it has a pumpkin with gears in it, because the two-wheel drive JKs still had a solid front axle, but there's no diff, right? That's a dead giveaway right there. So anyway, now, if you're gonna look for a JK, all right, I highly recommend it. They're fantastic vehicles. People joke, especially the Toyota guys, they like to joke about the reliability, but here's the bottom line, all right? The early JKs, they had a 3.8 liter V6. Didn't make a lot of power, but reliable as all get out, okay? Sure, they can potentially have some oil leaks, things like that, especially with age, so look into those kinds of things. But again, most of those are reasonably easily fixed. And if you're looking for something, especially as a trail vehicle, something that you're not going to load up your family a ton of weight and drive across the country in, it's a fine vehicle, okay? It had a 4-speed automatic, wasn't the strongest transmission, but it was good, okay? And it didn't have to be the strongest transmission when you put it behind a weaker motor. It's also a great candidate if you want a new-ish Jeep, but want to motor swap it right away. Don't buy a newer one with the 3.6 in it. We'll get to that motor in a second. Buy the older one with the 3.8. It's going to be cheaper, and then you can pull it out and motor swap it, right? Now, the early JKs also had a little bit less electronics to deal with and play with. The systems weren't as fragile. So things like motor swaps and axle swaps, they're a bit easier. You can still do it on a later JK, but they're easier to handle and make the Jeep happy on an earlier JK. And that's one of the other benefits that I forgot to mention about the TJ, guys. There's like no electronics other than the fuel injection. There's like no electronics, right? So skid control, things like that didn't exist back then. So doing motor swaps and axle swaps and changing tire sizes and that kind of stuff is real super easy on those older rigs. But anyway, back to the JK. Now, we're going to talk about some of the differences, right? We already said the 3.8 and the 4-speed, common transmissions. I'm not really going to talk a whole lot about the manuals, but go into the later JK, all right? So late 2012 is when they started really like kind of making the 3.6 liter. Now, 3.6 versus a 3.8, it is a smaller motor, 3.6, right? But it makes quite a bit more power. It makes nearly 300 horsepower, which isn't bad when you consider back like in the early 90s, like a Mustang, a 5-liter Mustang, V8 Mustang only made about 220 horsepower, right? So 300 horsepower or approaching 300, just less. It's not that bad, okay? It is a big vehicle, and they can be heavy, especially when you put big tires and axles on them and things like that. So they're not the fastest thing in the world, but they're certainly not the slowest. They can get out of their own way. That 3.6 is a very reliable motor, especially if you get a 3.6 after the year 2014. The 2013, early 2014 year, they had some problems with the driver's side cylinder head. It was just a production thing. They fixed it. And after that, there really aren't too many issues that plague the 3.6. You can go online, right? You can go online and you can find problems with any motor. But the fact of the matter is the 3.6 is a fantastic motor, okay? They put it in every Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler vehicle that gets a V6 from 2012 and up. They're still using it, right? So I mean, it is an awesome motor. There are millions and millions and millions of them out there on the road. So anytime you make that amount of motors, you're gonna be able to go on the internet and find that some of them have some issues. Now, the issues that they do have are repairable, right? There's something called the Pentastar valve tap. It's not valves, it's a bearing in your rocker arm. You pull the valve cover off, you unbolt the cams. It's very simple. You can do it at home in your own garage. And if it's a little bit above you, you can certainly bring it to a shop and it's not that bad to fix, okay? Especially if you catch it early. The oil cooler, right? I made a video about that. You should go check it out. It teaches you how to do an oil change, but it also shows you the problem that affects the oil cooler. I'm not going to get into that here. It's a very easy thing, and actually you'll never have a problem with the oil cooler if you do it correctly. So let's just put it there. But anyway, guys, the transmission in the later JKs with the 3.6 is an automatic 5-speed. It's called the NAG1 or the WA580. The reason that's such a good transmission is that 580 number symbolizes the torque rating. This transmission is rated for 580 pound-feet of torque, which is why if you were to Hemi swap a JK, you don't get a new transmission. They bolt it up to the one you got, okay? Because it is a stout transmission, especially when you only have that 3.6 in front of it, okay? But anyway, guys, onto the interior of these rigs, right? The suspension systems were more advanced, like I had already mentioned. You go inside, you got a lot more space. You got nicer seats. You got a nicer designed dashboard. Came with radio options, right? Alpine radios, things like that, easily upgradable as well. You had a rear seat, which is fantastic. And you had storage behind the rear seat as well as under it. So there's just plenty of storage in a vehicle like this. And if you take the rear seat out, then you have even more storage. People do that all the time, and then they go camping and they actually sleep in their Jeep, right? So it's kind of cool, all right? Excuse me here, wiping my head. Texas summer unedited video. It's hot in the garage, right? But anyway, guys, so there's a number of reasons to get a JK, and the aftermarket support is absolutely enormous for a JK, all right? Now, here's the other thing. And it's a big thing. 2-door versus 4-door. Now, 4-doors have a longer wheelbase. When you're talking about off-road, a longer vehicle, bigger vehicle, longer wheelbase means you have more room inside, okay? Which sometimes is nice off-road, depending upon what you're doing. Now, longer wheelbase, okay, makes it a lot more stable on steep climbs, things like that. But it also decreases the breakover angle, right? Like if you were to go over a steep rock ledge and you get your front end up and then you drive, sometimes you hit the belly of the Jeep. Whereas if you had a shorter wheelbase, you would get your front end up and your rear tires would climb before the belly of your Jeep hit that rock ledge, okay? And that is a problem with anything that has a longer wheelbase, okay? So tire size helps with that, okay? Lift height helps with that. And again, the fact that most of today's trails are worn away and cut out for a JK length because 4-door Jeeps are just super popular these days. But do you need one? Maybe you don't, right? Here's my thought on that. Okay, let's say you're 25 years old. Let's say you're 50 years old, all right? You don't have kids. Maybe your kids are grown up. They have their own vehicles, right? Because you're older now. You and your spouse, you and a dog, you, your spouse, and a dog. 2-door is just fine, especially if you remove the back seat. Actually, when you remove the back seat out of a 2-door JK, you actually have more room behind the front seats than you do in the storage area behind the rear seat of a JKU, the 4-door. So just FYI, plenty of storage. But here's my other thought about that. Going back to the 25-year-old, right? Going back to the younger guy. If you're buying one of these to build it, and you're like, man, I'm single, I'm 25, right? You're out of college, whatever, you just got out of trade school, you're an electrician, you're making good money, you're like, I want to build a Jeep. Badass. Do it. Highly recommend it. But 2-door might not be the thing for you. Because I'll tell you what, you put some money into this thing, even if you do it yourself and it doesn't cost you an arm and a leg. Let's just say it costs you a couple of fingers, right? And you're young. And now, 2 years from now, you meet the person of your dreams. You wind up getting married. You wind up having a couple of kids. And now you're like, oh, crap, I got a 2-door Jeep. There ain't no room in that thing, right? Well, if your plan is to maybe get married, maybe have kids, it's something maybe you want in the future, I wouldn't put a ton of money into a 2-door. That's just my opinion, okay? Because you're going to eventually have to sell it and start over again. And as we all know, Jeeps can be very expensive, right? Especially when you buy them, modify them, sell them, you're not going to get your money back. And then you're trying to buy another one to start all over and modify it all over again, okay? So it might just be worth it to just buy the 4-door. Have a little bit more room. And when your life changes, it can change, you know, and adapt because the 4-door will fit that life, right? It's just my thought. I also don't mind having more room for tools and things like that. It's never been a problem for me. okay? The whole 2-door versus 4-door. I love my 4-door, all right? 2-doors are cool, but they're a lot more rare. And if you're not building it to be like purely a toy and a crawler, I think a 4-door fits a lot of people's lives a little bit better, right? Storage room, cargo, things like that. It's pretty awesome, all right? But guys, that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it here, okay? The JLs, the JLUs, they're awesome. They're just newer versions of the JK, right? They have the same motor in them unless you get a Hemi. They just came out with that. They do have a better trans. The 8-speed is even better than the 5-speed, but the 5-speed is good, okay? The 5-speed is good. And the room inside is the same. They did make some additions to the JL, right? The rear seat actually has vents for the air conditioning in the back of the center console. That's kind of nice. You have a little bit more leg room, right? They did do some things, and they did do them right on the JL, but they're expensive, okay? They're still too new, and they're very expensive, and they have a lot more electronics in them than the JKs do. So if you're actually taking it off-road and you're modifying your vehicle, electronics are those things these days where these computers are so locked down, it's really hard to get that computer happy when you're putting axles under it that are from a Ford F-350, right? So it's doable. Again, people do it, okay? I'm not saying they don't, but it's a little easier to do, especially if you're gonna do it yourself in your own garage at home, all right? Guys, I'm gonna leave you with that, all right? It's hot in here. We've talked about a lot. Again, my personal experience and recommendation is that you think about what you're using your Jeep for, what your budget is, what your life looks like now, and what it might look like in a few years, and then buy your Jeep accordingly, okay, so that it fits your life. Again, my plan, you've heard me say it over on my Instagram, right, at WarPaintJKU, when this motor goes, I'm just going to replace it because there's no point in me buying another brand new Jeep. My suspension is all new. My axles are new, right? My brakes are new. And then when they're not, I'll replace them. Like, I don't need to buy a whole new Jeep and then start over again when I can just spend about $5,000 and get a motor sent to my house and bolt it in, right? It's not that difficult. Those videos are coming, by the way. So anyway, guys, that's it, all right? I appreciate all the support. Keep it rolling. Share the video. Hit the like button. Drop a comment. Let me know what you think, because I definitely did not cover everything, all right? I'm sure some of you guys have some other thoughts that I just didn't have time to talk about, right? I could do this all day. But anyway, guys, that's it, all right? Go out there and build something.